A simple butcher in a quiet, dusty town, a man known for his gentle hands and his kind heart. And it's about his son, a boy on the cusp of manhood, who is about to learn that the father he knows is a lie, a carefully constructed ghost. He's about to discover that his father's hands, which so skillfully carve a side of beef, once performed a much darker and much deadlier art. The world of 17-year-old Ethan Kane was a world of simple, comforting, and visceral truths. It was the sharp, clean smell of sawdust on the floor of his father's butcher shop. It was the solid, honest weight of a side of beef on his shoulder. It was the rhythmic, percussive thump-thump-thump of his father's cleaver, a sound that was as steady and as reliable as his own heartbeat. His father, Jacob Kane, was the butcher of the small, quiet town of Serenity, and to Ethan, he was the center of a small, orderly, and very peaceful universe. Jacob was a man of quiet, profound gentleness. He was not a large man, but he possessed a weary, deceptive strength. His hands, though stained with the constant, honest work of his trade, were surprisingly delicate and precise. He could break down a carcass with the skill of a surgeon, his movements economical, graceful, and utterly devoid of any wasted motion. He was a kind man, his eyes a warm, soft brown, his smile a rare but genuine thing that could light up his otherwise somber face. He was a widower, having lost his wife, Ethan's mother, to a fever when Ethan was just a boy, and the two of them, father and son, had forged a bond that was a thing of quiet, and spoken, and very deep affection. Ethan's life was a predictable, and a happy, one. He worked in the shop with his father after his lessons with the town schoolmarm. He was learning the trade, the secrets of the different cuts of meat, the art of the sharp knife. He was a good son, a good student, and he was in love, in the pure, absolute, and very serious way that only a 17-year-old can be, with Sarah, the beautiful, intelligent, and kind-hearted daughter of the town's doctor. His future, like the straight, dusty main street of Serenity, seemed to stretch out before him, simple, clear, and full of a quiet, unassuming promise. The first, subtle crack in the foundation of Ethan's world appeared on a hot, dusty Tuesday afternoon. 3 strangers rode into town. This was not an unusual occurrence. Drifters and prospectors often passed through. But these men were different. They were not just passing through. They were looking for something. They were hard-faced men, their clothes and their gear of a quality that spoke of money, but their eyes held the cold, dead emptiness of men who were no strangers to violence. They did not drink at the saloon. They did not stay at the hotel. They moved through the town with a quiet, watchful, and deeply unsettling purpose. Ethan was sweeping the sawdust from the floor of the shop when the leader of the 3 men entered. He was a tall, elegant man, dressed in a tailored, dark suit, a strange and jarring sight in the rustic, dusty town. His face was handsome, but his smile was a thin, reptilian twisting of his lips that did not reach his cold, gray eyes. The man did not look at the cuts of meat hanging in the display case. He looked at Jacob, a long, slow, and very deliberate look. A look of a man who has just found something he has been searching for a very, very long time. "I am looking for a man," the stranger said, his voice a low, cultured, and silken purr that was more menacing than any rough shout. Jacob did not look up from the piece of steak he was trimming. His hands, for the first time that Ethan could ever remember, were not perfectly steady. There was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in them. "There are a lot of men in this town, mister," Jacob said, his voice a low, non-committal grumble. The stranger smiled. "Oh, I think you know the man I am looking for. He is a man of particular skills. A man who was once known in the gaslight, decadent underworld of New Orleans as the surgeon. A man who could carve a man up with a blade as easily as you carved that piece of beef. A man who disappeared 15 years ago, after a certain disagreement with his employers." Jacob finally looked up. His face, usually so calm and kind, was a pale, tight mask. The warm, soft light in his brown eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard, and very dangerous darkness. "You have the wrong man," he said, his voice a low, dead sound. "I am a butcher." The stranger chuckled, a low, soft, and utterly chilling sound. "Are you?" he said. He took a step closer, his eyes flicking to Ethan, a look of cold, appraising interest in them. "You have a fine son. A good, strong boy." It would be a tragedy if something were to happen to him. He then turned and walked out of the shop, his polished boots making no sound on the sawdust-covered floor. Ethan stared at his father. He had never seen this man before. This cold, hard, and suddenly very dangerous stranger who was wearing his father's face. "Father," Ethan whispered, his voice a trembling, confused sound. Who was that man? What did he mean? Jacob did not answer. He just stood there, his cleaver in his hand, his knuckles white, his eyes staring at the empty doorway, at the ghost of a past that had just, in a cloud of dust and a whisper of a threat, written back into his quiet, peaceful, and very carefully constructed life. The simple, comforting world of the butcher's son had just been shattered, and in its place was a new, terrifying, and very deadly mystery. The silence that fell over the butcher shop after the stranger's departure was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of unspoken questions and the cold, metallic taste of a fear Ethan had never known. He looked at his father, and for the first time in his life, he was looking at a complete and utter stranger. The kind, gentle, and predictable man he had known his entire life was gone. In his place stood a figure of stone, his face a grim, unreadable mask, the cleaver in his hand looking less like a tool of his trade and more like a weapon. "Father," Ethan asked again, his voice a hoarse whisper. What did he mean? The surgeon. New Orleans. Jacob Kane slowly, deliberately, placed the cleaver on the heavy, hard wooden block. He turned and looked at his son, and in his eyes, Ethan saw a profound and very deep weariness. The look of a man who has just been forced to confront a ghost he had long believed to be dead and buried. "It is a story from a long time ago, Ethan," he said, his voice a low, rough sound, as if it were being dragged up from a deep and very dark well. "A life that is not mine anymore." He did not want to tell him. Ethan could see the desperate, protective instinct in his father's eyes. But he could also see the dawning, grim realization that the time for secrets and for lies was over. The past had not just knocked on their door, it had kicked it in. That night, in the small, clean, and suddenly very claustrophobic confines of their small house behind the shop, the story was told. It was not a story of a simple butcher. It was the story of a man who had once been known as the surgeon of the Vieux Carré, the most feared and the most respected assassin in the city of New Orleans. Jacob had been an orphan, raised in the brutal and forgiving world of the city's back alleys. He had learned to fight and to kill to survive. But he was not a common thug. He had a gift, a kind of genius. He had a surgeon's hands, a strategist's mind, and a ghost's ability to move through the world unseen. He had been recruited, as a young man, into a secret and very powerful criminal organization known only as the Syndicate. They were not common criminals. They were men of power and influence, who controlled the city's politics, its commerce, its very soul, from the shadows. And Jacob, the surgeon, had been their most valuable and most deadly tool. He was not a killer for hire. He was an artist of a very particular and very final kind of justice. He was the man they sent when a problem could not be solved with money or with threats. He was the man who kept the peace, a brutal, bloody, but very stable peace, in their corrupt, decadent world. "I was a young man," Jacob said, his voice a low, pained murmur, as he stared into the flames of the small hearth. "I was a fool. I thought it was a kind of honor, a code. I thought I was serving a purpose. The end had come, as it always does, with a betrayal. He had been sent to retire a rival, a man who had broken their code. It was supposed to have been a clean, surgical operation, but he had been set up. The job was a trap, designed by a young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless up-and-comer in the Syndicate, a man named Julian Thorne, the same elegant and very deadly man who had just walked into his shop. Thorne had wanted to eliminate not just the rival, but the Syndicate's most powerful and most independent enforcer as well. The job had turned into a bloodbath, a chaotic, messy, and very public gunfight. And in the crossfire, an innocent had been killed. A young woman, a singer in a nightclub, who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. "I had killed dozens of men, Ethan," Jacob said, his voice a raw, broken sound. "Men who were, in their own way, a part of the game. But she was innocent. And her blood was on my hands. The death of the innocent woman had been the event that had shattered his world. He had seen the true, ugly face of the life he was living. He had seen that there was no honor, no code, only a bottomless, soul-crushing abyss of greed and violence. He had walked away. He had killed the two men Thorne had sent to silence him, had taken a stash of the syndicate's emergency money, and had disappeared. He had ridden west, had changed his name, had become a simple butcher, a man who carved dead animals, not living men. He had met Ethan's mother, a kind, gentle woman who had seen not the killer, but the broken man beneath, and she had, for a brief, beautiful time, healed him. He had thought he had buried the surgeon forever. But Julian Thorne was not a man to forget a grudge. He was a patient, and a very persistent, predator. He had risen through the ranks of the syndicate, had become its undisputed, and utterly ruthless, leader. And for 15 years, he had been hunting for the one man who had defied him, the one loose end in his perfect, bloody tapestry of power. And now, he had found him. Ethan listened, his mind reeling, his simple, black and white world now a swirling, confusing, and very terrifying shade of gray. His father, his gentle, kind, and loving father, was a killer, a legendary assassin. "What does he want, father?" Ethan asked, his voice a small, frightened sound. "He does not just want me dead," Jacob replied, his voice a low, grim whisper. "That would be too simple. Thorne is a man who enjoys the theater of cruelty. He wants to destroy my life, just as he believes I destroyed his. He wants to take away the one thing that I have built, the one thing that matters. He wants to take away you." The threat was no longer a vague, veiled thing. It was a cold, hard, and very personal reality. The sins of the father, which had been buried for 15 long, quiet years, had just been visited upon the son. And Ethan knew, with a dawning, chilling certainty, that his simple, peaceful life was over, and a new, very dangerous, and very bloody chapter was about to begin. The morning after Julian Thorne's visit, the town of Serenity awoke to a new, and very unsettling, reality. Thorne and his two men, who were the very picture of quiet, professional menace, had taken rooms at the town's only hotel. They did not swagger. They did not boast. They simply were. A silent, watchful, and deeply intimidating presence that settled over the town like a shroud. The townspeople, who were accustomed to a simple, predictable world, did not know what to make of them. They were clearly men of wealth and power, and the town's mayor and sheriff, men who were more comfortable with paperwork than with gunplay, treated them with a nervous, fawning deference. But Ethan saw them for what they were. He saw the way their eyes, which were as cold and as dead as a snake's, missed nothing. He saw the subtle, confident way their hands always hovered near the expensive, custom-made pistols that were hidden beneath their tailored coats. They were wolves, and they were dressed in the finest sheep's clothing. His father, Jacob, was a man transformed. The quiet, gentle butcher was gone. In his place was a creature of profound, and very still, watchfulness. He moved through his day, through the familiar, comforting rituals of his trade, but his mind was elsewhere. He was a man who was living in two worlds at once, the sunlit, peaceful world of his shop, and the dark, shadowy world of his past. He was a man who was preparing for a war. The first, subtle move in that war was a war of information. Jacob sent Ethan on a series of seemingly simple, innocent errands. He sent him to the hotel, to deliver a specially prepared cut of meat for the hotel's kitchen. He sent him to the livery stable, to check on a lame horse. He sent him to the general store, for a sack of beans. But these were not just errands. They were reconnaissance missions. And Ethan, who was a smart, and a very observant boy, understood his new role. He was no longer just the butcher's son. He was a scout, a spy. He moved through the town with a new, heightened awareness. He listened. He watched. He learned. He learned the names of Thorne's two men, a silent, brutal giant of a man named Brutus, and a smaller, weary, and very fast-looking man named Lefty. He learned that Thorne was expecting a shipment on the evening stagecoach, a shipment that was clearly more than just luggage. And he learned, from a piece of a whispered, overheard conversation in the saloon, that Thorne was not just here for revenge. He was here on business. The syndicate was expanding, and this small, quiet, and strategically located town was to be the first new jewel in its western crown. Ethan reported his findings to his father in the quiet, sawdust-scented confines of the butcher shop that evening. Jacob listened, his face a grim and readable mask, his hands, which were busy sharpening a long, wicked-looking boning knife, never ceasing their slow, steady, and very deliberate work. "The shipment will be men," Jacob said, his voice a low, dead sound. "More of his killers. He is consolidating his position. He is turning this town into his personal fortress." He paused, the knife now honed to a razor's edge. "We cannot let that happen. We must cut the head off the snake before it has a chance to grow." The decision was made. They would not wait for Thorn to make his move. They would make their own. It would be a desperate and incredibly dangerous gambit. A father and a son, a butcher and his apprentice, against a team of professional and very deadly killers. The first cut in their quiet, desperate, and very personal war was to be made that night. Jacob's plan was a thing of beautiful, simple, and very deadly logic. It was a plan worthy of the surgeon. It was not a plan of guns and bullets. It was a plan of stealth, of silence, and of the unique, and very deadly, tools of his own trade. He and Ethan closed the shop at the usual time, but they did not go home. They waited in the deep, silent darkness of the shop for the town to go to sleep. At midnight, they moved to silent, dark-clad figures, melting into the back alleys of the town. Their target was the livery stable, the place where Thorn and his men had stabled their fine, expensive horses. They moved with a practiced, coordinated silence, a father and a son who had worked together in a small, enclosed space for a lifetime. Ethan, with his youthful agility, was the lookout. Jacob was the weapon. They reached the livery stable. It was a dark, quiet place, smelling of hay and horsehide. A single, sleepy stable boy was dozing in a chair by the entrance. Jacob did not kill him. He was not that man anymore. He moved with a silent, ghost-like grace. A single, precise, and non-lethal blow to the base of the boy's neck, and the boy slumped into a deep and very peaceful sleep. They were inside. They found the stalls that held the horses of Thorn and his men, and Jacob went to work. He was not a butcher of animals now. He was a surgeon, and his operating theater was the silent, hay-strewn floor of the stable. He used not a gun, but a small, razor-sharp, and very specialized knife, a tool he used for the most delicate of his work. He did not kill the horses. That would be a senseless and a very noisy cruelty. He did something far more subtle and far more effective. With a surgeon's precise and very knowledgeable touch, he made a series of small, deep, and very precise cuts to the tendons in the horse's legs. The cuts were almost invisible, and they would not be noticed in the dark. But the moment any real weight was put on them, the moment a man tried to ride them at any speed, the tendons would tear, and the horse would be instantly and catastrophically lamed. He had just, in a single silent and very bloody act, dismounted Thorn's entire cavalry. He had cut the legs out from under his enemy, without firing a single shot. As they slipped away, back into the darkness, Ethan looked at his father with a new and very profound sense of awe and terror. He had just witnessed the work of a master. The first cut had been made, and it had been a deep one. The dawn that broke over the town of Serenity was a tense, expectant one. The air was still, the usual, comforting sounds of the town waking up, the blacksmith's hammer, the rattle of a milk wagon where oxen. The town was holding its breath, waiting for the next move in a game it did not understand. In the butcher shop, Jacob and Ethan also waited. But their waiting was that of a hunter, a predator who has laid his trap and is now patiently waiting for his prey to blunder into it. The first sign that the trap had been sprung came in the form of a low, angry roar of frustration from the direction of the livery stable. One of Thorn's men, the weary, fast-looking one named Lefty, had just discovered that his fine, expensive Kentucky thoroughbred was now a three-legged, useless animal. The discovery sent a wave of confusion and panicked anger through Thorn's small, isolated army. Their horses, their pride, their only means of escape from this dusty, backwater town, were all mysteriously and catastrophically crippled. They were trapped. Julian Thorn was a man who did not tolerate failure or incompetence. His reaction to the news was a thing of cold, reptilian fury. He beat the young, terrified stable boy to within an inch of his life, his rage a terrifying, public display of his own, unraveling control. He knew who had done this. It was not a random act. It was a message. A surgical, precise, and very personal message from the man he had come here to destroy. The surgeon. He had underestimated his old adversary. He had thought he was hunting a broken, retired old man. He had not realized he was hunting a master. But Thorn was not a man to be deterred. He was a creature of immense, and very resourceful, evil. His cavalry was gone. But his infantry, the shipment of new men he was expecting, was still on its way. The evening stagecoach was now his only priority. It was his lifeline, his reinforcement. He sent his two men, the brutal giant Brutus, and the now very much on foot Lefty, to the edge of town, to the small, wooden-way station where the stage was due to arrive. Their orders were simple: meet the new men, and escort them, and their cargo of weapons, back to the hotel. This was the moment Jacob had been waiting for. This was the second part of his plan. To cut off not just the head of the snake, but its body as well. He and Ethan slipped out the back of their shop, their movements now a familiar, practiced dance of stealth and purpose. They did not head for the way station. That would be a fool's game, a direct, and a very deadly, confrontation. They went to a place a mile outside of town, a place where the stagecoach road made a sharp, blind turn around a tall, rocky outcrop. It was a perfect, natural ambush point. And they were not alone. Waiting for them, hidden in the rocks, was the one other, true friend they had in this town, Sarah, the doctor's daughter. She was not there as a damsel in distress. She was there as an ally. In her hands, she held her father's heavy, and very accurate, Sharp's rifle. She was a good shot, a skill her father had insisted she learn, a practical, and now very necessary, piece of a frontier education. Ethan's heart, for a moment, forgot the terror of their situation. He saw her face a mask of grim, determined resolve, and his love for her was a fierce, protective fire in his chest. Jacob's plan was not to attack the stagecoach. It was to steal it. He had spent the afternoon preparing. He had borrowed the undertaker's black, horse-drawn hearse. He had painted over its grim, Gothic lettering with a crude, but convincing, imitation of the Wells Fargo logo. He had borrowed two strong, fast horses from the livery stable, two of the very few that had not been lamed. They waited. The sun began its slow, afternoon descent, and then they heard it. The distant, familiar rumble of the stagecoach. As the coach, a lumbering, dust-covered beast, approached the blind turn, their plan went into motion. It was a plan of beautiful, simple, and very audacious deception. Jacob, dressed in the undertaker's black, formal coat and hat, drove the fake Wells Fargo wagon out from its hiding place, directly into the path of the oncoming stage. The stage driver, a grizzled old man named Charlie, saw the wagon blocking the road and, with a curse, hauled on his reins, bringing his team of 6 horses to a plunging, dust-choked halt. "What in the hell?" Charlie began, his hand reaching for the shotgun by his side. But it was then that Ethan and Sarah made their move. From the rocks on either side of the road, they opened fire. They did not fire at the men on the coach. They fired at the lead horses. 2 sharp, coordinated rifle shots, and the 2 lead horses of the stage team went down, their fall a chaotic, tangled mess that completely and irrevocably disabled the coach. The 2 hired shotgun guards on the coach, men who had been expecting a quiet, uneventful ride, were thrown from their perches in the chaos. And as they scrambled to their feet, their guns in their hands, they found themselves looking at a new and very unexpected sight. A young, beautiful, and very determined-looking girl with a very large and very steady rifle aimed directly at their hearts. And from the other side of the road, Jacob, the surgeon, was now walking towards them, not with a cleaver, but with a short, heavy, and very deadly-looking shotgun in his hands. The serpent, the reinforcements that Thorn had been so desperately waiting for, had just been cut off, and the stage was now set for the final, bloody, and very personal act of this deadly play. The scene on the dusty stagecoach road was a masterpiece of controlled and very temporary chaos. The 2 Wells Fargo guards, their faces a mask of stunned, uncomprehending shock, found themselves in an impossible situation. In front of them stood a grim, shotgun-wielding figure who looked like a death angel undertaker. To their right, a young, beautiful, and very determined girl held a bead on them with a rifle that could kill a buffalo at 1,000 yards. Their will to fight, which was based on a simple, financial calculation, evaporated in the hot, dry air. They threw down their guns. Inside the coach, the 4 new men who were Thorne's reinforcements were in a state of panicked, claustrophobic confusion. They were killers, but they were killers who were trapped in a box, their field of fire limited to the small, narrow windows of the coach. Jacob did not give them time to think. He was not there to negotiate. He was there to deliver a message. "You have 2 choices," he called out, his voice a low, hard, and utterly uncompromising tone that cut through the nervous whinnying of the horses. "You can come out, with your hands empty, or you can die in that box." He punctuated the statement by firing one barrel of his shotgun, not at the coach, but at the ground just in front of it. The blast of buckshot kicking up a geyser of dust and rock that was a terrifying, and very convincing, demonstration of his intent. The door to the coach was thrown open, and 4 men, their faces a mixture of anger and a new, very healthy fear, stumbled out, their hands raised high. The butcher's bill for this particular engagement was a simple one: 4 new prisoners, 2 disarmed guards, and a stagecoach full of weapons and ammunition that was now the property of the fledgling army of Serenity. The work that followed was a model of swift, efficient, and very professional precision. Jacob and Ethan tied the prisoners and the guards, their movements the practiced, efficient motions of men who knew their way around a knot. They then unloaded the coach. It was an arsenal. A half-dozen new, repeating Henry rifles, a crate of shotguns, and enough ammunition to start a small war. This was the true prize. Not money, but the tools of power, the means to fight back. They left the prisoners and the guards, securely bound but unharmed, with enough water to last them until they were found. They left the disabled coach, a silent, eloquent testament to their victory, and they took the arsenal, loading it onto the back of the undertaker's hearse. They were no longer just a father and a son. They were a victorious, and now very well-armed, army. They returned to Serenity under the cover of darkness, their hearse, now a war wagon, a strange, gothic, and very much triumphant sight. They did not go to the butcher shop. They went to the one other safe haven in the town, the doctor's house. Dr. Miller, Sarah's father, was a man of science, a man of peace. But he was also a man who had seen the cold, dead eyes of Thorne's ambition, and he was a father who would do anything to protect his daughter. His home, and his medical knowledge, were now a part of the rebellion. In the quiet, antiseptic-scented confines of the doctor's study, a new, and very real, council of war was held. Jacob, Ethan, the doctor, and Sarah. They were the 4, and likely pillars of the town's resistance. They had won a major victory. They had cut off Thorne's reinforcements. They had captured his weapons. They had crippled his cavalry. They had, in a single, audacious stroke, evened the odds. But they all knew that this was not the end. It was the beginning of the end. "He will be a cornered animal now," Jacob said, his voice a low, grim rumble, as he cleaned the shotgun that had just, so effectively, spoken for him. And a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. He will no longer be content to wait. He will no longer try to squeeze this town. He will try to kill it. He was right. In the saloon in Serenity, Julian Thorne, who had just received the news of the stagecoach disaster from the terrified, fleeing forms of Brutus and Lefty, was a man transformed. The cool, calculating, and patient strategist was gone. In his place was a creature of pure, raw, and very personal rage. He had been outmaneuvered. He had been humiliated. He had been beaten. Not by an army, not by the law, but by a simple butcher, a boy, a girl, and a country doctor. His plan to build an empire was in ashes. All that was left was the burning, all-consuming need for revenge. He gathered his last remaining, and now very terrified men. He did not offer them money. He did not offer them a plan. He offered them blood. "We will burn that town to the ground," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper, his eyes the eyes of a madman. "We will kill every man, every woman, every child. We will erase it from the face of the earth. And we will start with the doctor's daughter. The final, bloody, and very personal battle for the soul of Serenity was at hand. And it would be fought not on a dusty road, or in the back alleys, but in the streets of the town itself. The night descended on the town of Serenity not with a gentle, peaceful quiet, but with the heavy, pregnant silence of a coming storm. The townspeople knew. They could feel it in the air. The final, bloody reckoning with Julian Thorne and his cornered, rabid wolves was at hand. But they were no longer a flock of frightened, scattered sheep. They were a community that had found its courage, its leaders, and, thanks to the captured stagecoach, its teeth. Under the calm, steady direction of Jacob Kane, the town of Serenity was transformed into a fortress. The main street was barricaded at both ends with overturned wagons and barrels of dirt. The women and children were moved to the safest, most defensible building in the town, the small, stone-walled church at the top of the main street. The men of the town, their faces grim, their new Henry rifles held with a new, hard-won confidence, took up their positions, in the windows, on the roofs, in the alleys. They were not professional soldiers, but they were men who were fighting for their homes, for their families, and that made them the most dangerous kind of army of all. The command center of this new, defiant town was the doctor's house. It was a sturdy, two-story building at the edge of town, with a clear line of sight down the main street. It was to be their Alamo. Inside, the four, and likely leaders of the rebellion made their final preparations. Dr. Miller, his sleeves rolled up, was laying out his surgical instruments on the kitchen table, turning his home into a field hospital. Sarah, her face a pale, determined mask, was loading rifles, her movements swift and sure. Ethan, who had in the space of a few short days been transformed from a boy into a man, was standing guard at an upstairs window, his eyes scanning the dark, empty plains. And Jacob was in the cellar. He was not preparing for a siege. He was preparing for a hunt. He stood before a large, locked, and very old-looking trunk, a trunk that had not been opened in 15 long, quiet years. He opened it. Inside, nestled in dark, faded velvet, was the ghost of the man he had once been, the surgeon. He took out a long, dark, and very fine leather coat, a coat that was designed not for warmth, but for movement, its insides lined with a half-dozen hidden pockets. He took out a set of thin, perfectly balanced, and very deadly-looking throwing knives. And he took out a strange, and very beautiful, weapon. It was a custom-made, silver-inlaid, Bowie knife, but its blade was thinner, and its point was sharper than any normal knife. It was a surgeon's scalpel, forged into the body of a killer's blade. He strapped the knives to his forearms, to his boots. He slipped the scalpel knife into a hidden sheath at the small of his back. He was no longer just a butcher who knew how to fight. He was the surgeon again, and he was about to perform his final, and most important, operation. The attack came just after midnight. It was not a subtle, probing attack. It was a full-frontal, desperate, and very personal assault. Julian Thorne, his mind now a raging, all-consuming inferno of hatred, led his last half-dozen men in a wild, screaming charge down the main street. He was not trying to win a battle. He was trying to burn the world down. Their target was the doctor's house. Their target was Sarah. The town of Serenity erupted in a roar of gunfire. The men of the town, from their hidden, fortified positions, opened up in a disciplined, devastating volley. The street was turned into a killing box, a crossfire of righteous, and very accurate, lead. Thorne's men, caught in the open, were cut to pieces. One went down, then another. They were not fighting a handful of amateurs anymore. They were fighting a whole town, a town that was very, very angry. Thorne himself, fueled by a madman's luck and a madman's rage, made it through. He and his last two men, the brutal giant Brutus and the weary, fast-gunned Lefty, reached the doctor's house. They kicked in the door and stormed inside, their guns blazing. The house was dark. It was silent. It was empty. "It's a trap," Lefty hissed, his eyes nervously scanning the shadows. But it was too late. From the top of the stairs, a shotgun roared, and Lefty was thrown back, out of the very door he had just entered. And from the shadows of the parlor, a new, and very old, and very deadly figure emerged. Jacob Kane, the surgeon. He did not have a gun in his hand. He had a knife. The final, brutal, and very intimate battle began. It was not a gunfight. It was a brawl, a close quarters, life or death struggle in the dark, silent rooms of the doctor's house. Brutus, the giant, charged, a roar of pure, animal fury on his lips. Jacob did not meet his charge. He moved, a silent, fluid blur, and as the giant lumbered past, the scalpel knife in Jacob's hand made a single, precise, and very final cut across the back of the man's knee. The giant screamed and went down, his leg a useless, crippled ruin. Now, only Thorn was left. The two old adversaries, the two ghosts from a long ago, and very bloody, New Orleans night, now stood facing each other in the dark, silent, and very much changed world of a small, and very defiant, frontier town. The doctor's parlor had become an operating theater for a very different kind of surgery. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood. The only light was the pale, ghostly moonlight that streamed through the shattered windows, illuminating the two final combatants in a stark, dramatic tableau. Julian Thorne and Jacob Kane, the syndicate boss and his former, most deadly, assassin. They were two sides of the same, blood-stained coin, two men whose pasts had been inextricably, and very violently, intertwined. Thorne was a creature of a civilized, sophisticated evil. He was a man who killed with orders, with money, with a clean, detached, and very modern kind of brutality. Jacob, the surgeon, was a creature of an older, more primal kind of violence, a man whose work was a thing of the hands, of the blade, of a deep, and very intimate, understanding of the frail, fragile nature of the human body. Thorne had a pistol in his hand, a small, elegant, and very deadly-looking derringer. He was not a brawler. He was a duelist, and in the close, confined spaces of the parlor, he was in his element. Jacob stood, his scalpel knife held in a low, ready grip, his body a coiled spring of potential energy. He was wounded, a long, shallow gash on his forearm from the brief, brutal encounter with Brutus, but he did not seem to feel it. His eyes, the warm, gentle brown eyes of the butcher, were now as cold, as hard, and as focused as a surgeon's. It always had to end this way, didn't it, Jacob? Thorne said, his voice a low, cultured, and surprisingly comper. He was a man who was, in his own, twisted way, enjoying this. The final, dramatic, and very personal confrontation. The student and the master. I learned everything I know from you, you know. The art of the clean, quiet kill. The importance of precision. You learned nothing, Jacob replied, his voice a low, dead sound that held no trace of the man he had been, or the man he had tried to become. You learned only the mechanics of death. You never understood its soul. You never understood the weight of it. He was not just talking about the innocent woman in New Orleans. He was talking about his own long, and very heavy, penance. Thorne just smiled, his thin, reptilian smile. The soul is a luxury for priests and poets, Jacob. In our world, there is only power, and the finality of a well-placed bullet. He fired. The derringer, for all its small size, made a deafening roar in the enclosed space. But Jacob was not there. He moved with a speed that was not human, a blur of motion in the pale moonlight. He was a ghost, a whisper, a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to be in the one place his enemy was not. The bullet tore a hole in the plaster wall behind him, and as Thorne was fumbling to reload the single-shot weapon, Jacob was on him. It was not a charge. It was a dissection. He did not go for the kill. That was not his purpose. His purpose was to dismantle, to deconstruct, the man who had destroyed his life. His scalpel knife was a blur of silver. A cut here, to the tendons in Thorne's gun hand, and the derringer clattered uselessly to the floor. A cut there, to the nerves in his shoulder, and the man's arm was a dead, flapping appendage. Thorne screamed, a high, thin sound of pure, uncomprehending agony and terror. He was being taken apart, piece by piece, by a master who knew every nerve, every tendon, every secret, fragile place in the human body. He stumbled back, his face a mask of a new, and very personal, kind of hell. And it was then that Ethan appeared in the doorway. He had seen the last of Thorne's men fall. He had come to help his father. He stood there, a Henry rifle in his hand, his young, determined face a stark contrast to the brutal, bloody, and very intimate scene in the parlor. He saw the two men. He saw Thorne, crippled and weeping. He saw his father, a dark, terrible, and magnificent figure of retribution, the bloody scalpel knife in his hand. He raised his rifle. He could end it. Now. No, son, Jacob said, his voice a low, hoarse, and very tired sound. He did not turn. His eyes never left Thorn's. This is not your fight. This is not your sin. This is my penance. My promise. He was not just speaking to Ethan. He was speaking to the ghost of his wife, to the memory of the promise he had made to her, so long ago, to leave the world of the surgeon behind. A promise he had just, in this final, bloody night, been forced to break. He turned to Thorn, the broken, pathetic man who was now at his mercy. He did not raise his knife. He did not offer a final, killing blow. He just stood there, his chest heaving, the rage, the grief, the 15 years of a buried, and now resurrected, life, all a swirling, chaotic storm within him. And from the top of the stairs, another figure appeared. Sarah. She was not holding a gun. She was holding a lantern, and its warm, steady, and very human light filled the room, chasing away the ghostly, pale moonlight, and illuminating the true, and very terrible, cost of this final, bloody victory. The warm, steady light of Sarah's lantern was a thing of profound, and very simple, clarity. It fell upon the scene in the parlor not with the dramatic, ghostly judgment of the moon, but with the quiet, honest light of a home. It illuminated the wreckage, the blood, and the three solitary figures who were the last living remnants of a long and very bloody night. Ethan stood in the doorway, his rifle held in a white-knuckled grip, his young face a battlefield of 1,000 conflicting emotions. He had seen his father not as a simple butcher, but as a terrible, magnificent, and very deadly warrior. And he did not know if he should be proud or terrified. Julian Thorne lay on the floor, a broken, weeping, and utterly defeated man, his empire of fear and ambition in ruins around him, his life now a worthless, meaningless thing in the hands of the man he had so terribly wronged. And Jacob stood over his vanquished enemy, the bloody scalpel knife in his hand, his body aching, his soul weary beyond measure. He was the victor, but he did not feel triumphant. He just felt empty. The fire of his rage, the thing that had fueled him, the thing that had resurrected the surgeon, was gone, leaving only the cold, gray ashes of a profound and very deep sorrow. Sarah walked slowly into the room. She did not look at Thorn. She did not look at the blood. She looked at Jacob. She looked at her father's friend, at the man who had been a quiet, gentle, and very constant presence in her own young life. She saw not the killer, not the legend. She saw a man who was in a deep and very terrible pain. She walked to him and gently, with a courage that was more profound than any act of violence, she took the bloody knife from his hand. She then took his other hand, the one that was not stained with the work of his trade, and she held it. "It's over, Uncle Jacob," she said, her voice a low, soft, and very gentle sound. "It's over. You can come home now." The simple words, the simple, human touch, were the thing that finally broke him. A great, shuddering, and very human sob tore from his chest. The ghost of the surgeon, the cold, hard, and emotionless killer, was finally, and irrevocably, banished, washed away in a flood of 15 years of a buried, and very necessary, grief. He was just Jacob Kane again. A butcher, a father, a man. The dawn that broke over the town of Serenity was a new, and a very different, kind of dawn. The town had been to hell and back. It was scarred, wounded, but it was not broken. It was cleansed. Julian Thorne was not killed. He was given a different, and a far more fitting, kind of justice. He was tied to a horse and was delivered, along with his few surviving, and now very talkative, men, to the nearest U.S. Marshal's office, a day's ride away. He was a man who had lived by the power of his name, of his reputation. His trial, and the story of his downfall, would be a public, and a very humiliating, affair. His prison would not just be one of iron bars, but of a shattered, and very pathetic, legacy. The town of Serenity began to heal. They had lost friends. They had lost their innocence. But they had found something else. They had found their courage. They were no longer just a quiet, peaceful, and very vulnerable town. They were a community, a town that had fought for its own survival, a town that had, in the end, saved itself. And what of the butcher and his son? The butcher shop opened again, a week later. The familiar, comforting sound of the cleaver on the block returned, a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the center of the town. But the man who wielded the cleaver was a different man. Jacob Kane was still a man of quiet, and of a profound gentleness. But the sadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a new quiet, and very deep peace. He had faced his ghosts, and he had won. Ethan was no longer a boy. He was a man. He had seen the darkness that lay beneath the surface of the world, and of his own beloved father. But he had also seen the courage, the love, and the profound, and very human, strength that had, in the end, triumphed. He had learned the true, and very hard, lesson of what it means to be a man. And he had learned what it means to be the butcher's son. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the new, and very much healed, town of Serenity, Ethan and Sarah stood on the porch of the doctor's house. Their hands clasped together, their future a quiet, hopeful, and very much shared road that stretched out before them. They looked down the main street, and they saw Jacob Kane closing his shop for the night. He looked up, and he saw them. He did not wave. He simply smiled. A rare, and a very genuine, and a very beautiful smile. The smile of a man who was, after a lifetime of running, finally, and completely, at peace. The monster was buried. The man was home. The months that followed the night of the siege were a time of quiet, deliberate rebuilding, not just for the town of Serenity, but for the souls of the men and women who called it home. The physical scars on the town, bullet holes in the storefronts, the burned-out shell of the livery were slowly, methodically repaired, the work of a community that had been forged into a single, cohesive unit by the fires of their shared ordeal. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the echo of gunshots, a new, industrious, and very hopeful kind of music. The trial of Julian Thorne and his men was a distant, but very satisfying, piece of news that came by telegraph. Thorne, stripped of his power and his wealth, was a pathetic, broken figure in the courtroom. His own surviving men, eager to save their own skins, testified against him, their stories a lurid, damning account of his reign of terror. He was sentenced to life in the territorial prison at Yuma, a fate that was, for a man of his pride and ambition, a thing far worse than a quick, clean death on the gallows. The syndicate, its Western ambitions shattered, its secrets exposed, retreated back into the shadows of New Orleans, a wounded, but still very dangerous, beast. In Serenity, life returned to a new, and a very different, kind of normal. Jacob Kane's butcher shop was once again the quiet, steady heart of the town. But the man who worked there was a man transformed. The ghost of the surgeon was not gone, but it was no longer a haunting, terrifying presence. It was a quiet, integrated part of him, a source of a new, deep, and very profound stillness. The townspeople looked at him with a new, and a very different, kind of respect. He was not just their butcher. He was their protector, their silent, unassuming guardian. They did not speak of the night of the siege, but the knowledge of what he had done, of what he was capable of, was a powerful, and spoken, and very reassuring presence in their lives. Ethan, too, was a man now. He worked alongside his father in the shop, but his work was no longer just the work of an apprentice. It was the work of a partner. He had seen the best, and the worst, of his father, and of the world, and he had not broken. He had found his own quiet, and very steady strength. His love for Sarah was no longer the innocent, boyish infatuation of his youth. It was the deep, quiet, and very real love of a man, a love that had been tested by fire and had been found to be true. But the past, in the West, is never truly buried. It is a part of the land itself, a part of the dust that blows on the wind. The echo of the blade, the first, new sign of a trouble that was not yet over, arrived in the form of a letter. It came on the noon stage, a fine, elegant envelope of a kind that was rarely seen in a town like Serenity. It was addressed not to Jacob Kane, the butcher, but to the surgeon. Jacob opened it with his old, steady hands, a flicker of a long-forgotten, and very cold, light in his brown eyes. The letter was from New Orleans. It was not a threat. It was a plea. The syndicate, in the wake of Thorne's disastrous and very public failure, was in a state of civil war. The old, brutal peace that Jacob had once, so bloodily, maintained, was shattered. The city was a cauldron of violence, the different factions tearing each other apart, the streets running with the blood of the innocent as much as the guilty. The letter was from an old man, one of the last of the syndicate's original founders, a man who had been a kind of mentor to the young, orphaned Jacob. He was a man who had, in his own, twisted way, lived by a code. And he was a man who was losing. He was not asking the surgeon to come back and fight for him. He was asking for something else. He was asking for his help in saving a life. The life of his own young, and very innocent, granddaughter, a girl who had been caught in the crossfire of this new, brutal war, a girl who was now a pawn, a hostage, a prize to be claimed by the victor. "You are the only man I have ever known," the old man's letter concluded, "who possessed both the skills of a devil and the heart of a man. I am not asking for the devil to return. I am praying that the man still lives." Jacob sat in the quiet of his small, peaceful home, the letter in his hand, a ghost from a world he had thought he had left forever. He looked at his son, who was now a man. He thought of Sarah, and the quiet, simple, and very beautiful future that stretched out before them. He had found his peace. He had earned his serenity. But the echo of the blade was a powerful one, and the cry of an innocent, a ghost of the one innocent life he had failed to save so long ago, was a cry he did not know if he could ignore. The war for his own soul, which he had thought was over, had just, in a new, and a very unexpected, and a very distant way, begun again. The letter from New Orleans was a stone dropped into the quiet, peaceful pond of Jacob Kane's new life. Its ripples spread, disturbing the calm, reflecting a past he had fought so hard to escape. For a week, he was a man at war with himself. He was a creature of two worlds, the quiet, sunlit world of serenity, and the dark, gaslight, and very bloody world of his youth. He did not speak of the letter to Ethan. This was a burden that was his alone to bear. But Ethan saw the change in him. He saw the return of the old, haunted look in his father's eyes, the quiet, profound stillness that was not peace, but a deep, and very troubled, contemplation. He found his father one evening, not in the house, but in the forge. The forge was dark, the fires banked. Jacob was not working. He was standing before the anvil, his hand resting on the cold, hard steel. In his other hand, he held the letter. "You are thinking of going," Ethan said. It was not a question. It was a statement of a sad, and very deep, understanding. Jacob did not turn. He just stared at the anvil, the place where he had, for 15 years, hammered out a new, and a very different, kind of life. "There is a girl," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, "an innocent." "And you are not the man you were, father," Ethan replied, his voice quiet but firm. "You are not the surgeon. You are a butcher, a father. This is your home. This is your life." "Am I?" Jacob asked, his voice a raw, and a very honest, whisper of doubt. "Or is this just a role I have been playing? A lie I have been telling myself?" He was a man who was questioning the very foundation of his own, hard-won redemption. Had he truly changed? Or had the killer just been sleeping? The choice was a terrible one. To go would be to embrace the ghost of the surgeon, to step back into the world of blood and shadows he had so desperately fled. It would be to risk not just his life, but his very soul, the soul he had just, so painfully, reclaimed. But to stay would be to turn his back on the cry of an innocent, to become the very kind of man he had once, so ruthlessly, hunted. It would be to admit that his new life, his new moral code, was a thing of convenience, a thing that could be discarded when it became too difficult. He made his decision in the quiet, pre-dawn hours, in the silence of his own, very tested, heart. He came to Ethan as the sun was rising. He was not dressed as a butcher. He was not dressed as the surgeon. He was dressed as a simple traveler, in a plain, buckskin coat and sturdy, trail-worn boots. He had a single, small saddlebag in his hand. "I must go," he said, his voice a quiet, and a very firm, sound of a final, and a very difficult, resolve. "Then, I am going with you," Ethan replied, his own quiet resolve a perfect match for his father's. Jacob looked at his son, at the man he had become. He saw not a boy, but a partner, a man who had faced the darkness and had not flinched. He saw his own, better nature, reflected in his son's clear, honest eyes. He slowly, gently, shook his head. "No, son," he said. He placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip strong and steady. "Your place is here. Your place is to protect this town." To protect her. He did not have to say Sarah's name. "You are the butcher now, Ethan," he continued, his voice a low, proud rumble. "You are the heart of this town. And I am just a man who has an old, and a very final, debt to pay." He was not going as the surgeon. He was not going as a killer. He was going as a man who had made a choice to answer the call of a single, innocent life, a final, desperate attempt to balance the scales of his own, very heavy, soul. He rode out of Serenity that morning, a solitary figure on the vast, empty plains. He did not look back. He was a man riding towards a dangerous, and a very uncertain, future. But he was also a man who was, for the first time truly, and completely, free. He had been a killer. He had been a butcher. And now, in this final, quiet, and very personal act of grace, he was, at long last, just a man, on his own, and a very human, road to redemption. The story of the surgeon was over. The story of Jacob Kane, the quiet man of Serenity, was just, in a new, and a very different way, beginning.